Welcome, everyone. My name is Craig Volden. I'm a faculty member here in the Batten School and also director of the Center for Effective Lawmaking. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Jennifer Lawless. Many of you know her. She is the chair of the politics department here at UVA. She's also the editor of one of our prestigious journals, the American Journal of Political Science. Her research focuses on political ambition, campaigns and elections, and media and politics. And today we'll be talking about her recent report with Richard Fox entitled The Gender Gap in Political Ambition. Delighted to have a chance to talk with you, Jen.
Thank you.
So our format is that I'll start off by asking quite a few questions, but we'll make sure that you all in the audience have a chance to ask questions as well as we go along. And I wanted to start out not with the report itself, but with the background that you actually ran for Congress yourself in 2006. And thinking about what your research has shown, how exactly did that happen?
So I should note that people always said, oh, are you running for Congress because you wanted to write a book? And it turns out it's a lot more difficult to run for Congress than to write a book. So that was not why I ran. I ran because I was living in Rhode Island at the time. I was an assistant professor at Brown. I had been there for about 2 years. And the incumbent in this congressional district was a Democrat. It was a highly Democratic district. And he was ardently anti-choice, and I had always cared about reproductive rights. I had interned at Planned Parenthood when I was in college. He had voted several times against ending the war in Iraq. So this was we had been at war now for about 5 years. And he had also demonstrated a reluctance to support privacy rights in general. So he was a Democratic incumbent. He hadn't really been challenged since he had been elected 6 years earlier. Prior to that, he had been Secretary of State, and he had also been in the state legislature. So nobody was going to take him on. And I just felt like electoral competition matters, political campaigns matter, and Rhode Island hadn't had a woman in its congressional delegation in well over a decade. It had never had a female senator, it had never had a female governor, and at the time it ranked 38th in the percentage of women in the state legislature. So I just felt like, this is insane. He's not being held accountable. Nobody knows about his record. And I had just written a book about why women don't run for office. I knew I was qualified. So I started floating the idea, and ultimately the reason I wound up doing it was because he made a statement. He was asked whether he was interested in running for an open Senate seat. And he made a statement that, no, he was going to keep his House seat because he was safe there. He didn't want to have to really engage in a rigorous campaign. And I just thought, oh my gosh, not only aren't you held accountable, you're priding yourself on the fact that you're not held accountable. And that was it. And I was in, and there were 2 students who were graduating from Brown whose parents let them defer law school so that they could work full-time on my campaign for free. And so given that labor, I felt like we could get a head start, we could do this, and it ultimately was a 17-month campaign. I lost, which is why I'm here. But I got about 40% of the vote. And he just announced that he's retiring now. So a lot of people said, well, were you going to run against him again? 2006 was a very good time to take on conservative Democrats. Since then, he hasn't cast that many terrible votes, and he actually has become relatively pro-choice. But when he announced that he wasn't seeking re-election, my immediate thought was, do I like UVA enough to stay, or should I go back to Rhode Island? And I decided I like UVA enough to stay.
And we like you enough to
Thank you.
be happy about that choice. And so then what was the experience that you went through? Was it as horrible as some people have a sense it will be?
It's funny because it was unquestionably the best experience of my life. And there are moments where you're sort of like, what is going on? Like, you can't believe that anything you say could actually be picked up by the media, or you're pumping gas or going to the grocery store and somebody recognizes you and starts telling you about a problem. That's sort of stunning at first, and then it just becomes, what you do. But it became very clear to me early on that one of the reasons that women don't think that they're interested in running for office is because they say, well, I don't have thick enough skin, or I don't want the media rifling through my trash. And I think I thought that at the beginning. I remember when I told my parents that I was planning on entering the race, they, who had always been very, very supportive, called, and my mom said, we've talked about it. I was 30 at the time. We've talked about it, and we really aren't going to let you run for Congress. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm 30 years old, I'm independent, I have a job. And she was like, well, you cry a lot, and people are mean, and we really don't want you calling us all the time crying and telling us how mean everybody was. And I said, no, I promise I won't. And they reluctantly said, okay. And it's true, like the first 2 weeks, it was incredibly overwhelming. But you then develop the thick skin and the skills that you need, and it's a really, really fast process. And the way that I always sum up how fast this process was is that a couple of days before the election, so I'd been campaigning for a year and a half. We had raised $500,000. We were on TV. We had a very, very rigorous grassroots campaign, so people knew who I was. And the 2 days before the election, we were at grocery stores that were near polling places. So when people would go into the grocery store, we would encourage them to vote, and we would literally be able to point where they should go on election day to vote. And I'm standing at this table, and this woman parks her car, and she's coming up. She's like running up the parking lot of the grocery store, and she's like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited, and don't worry. And I'm thinking, oh, she's gonna say, don't worry, you're gonna win on Tuesday, or don't worry, you've got this. And instead, she looks at me and says loudly, and there are a lot of people around, don't worry, you don't look nearly as fat in real life as you do on TV.
Lovely.
And so I said, thank you, because really, what else does one say? And I laughed about it. And I remember thinking, if you would have told me a year and a half earlier that somebody was going to say that, I would have cried in anticipation of hearing that statement, right? So as you campaign and as you put yourself through it, it just becomes part of the process. And I would say I can count on one hand the number of utterly offensive things like that happened over the course of 17 months. The rest of the time, it's people telling you about how they'd never run for office, but they're so excited that somebody that looks like them is, or they'd never run for office, but they've got to hand it to me, even if they're not going to vote for me. That it takes guts and a vision, and it was just an incredibly fulfilling experience, and it made me way more empathetic. Like, you have no idea what people are going through until on a daily basis, you think you do, but then on a daily basis, you hear these stories, and it just makes it even more important, and the campaign becomes that much more important because you can then represent the people that are really looking to government to help improve their lives.
Mm-hmm. And did you feel there was a gendered tone to how you were treated versus your opponent?
No, so I think there was an age issue. I was pretty young, and so, Jennifer Lawless 30 was that was how every story opened. And the fact that I had never run for office before, being that young, was not an ideal thing. But I looked young too. I look way older now. I looked young too, and so my campaign manager, who was, a 22-year-old guy who knew nothing, I love him, and now he knows a lot, but he was like, well, we just need to make you look older. And so the solution to looking older was to just wear a dark suit everywhere I went. My hair had been long. I cut it really short. I had political helmet head, which is what, all female candidates have. And I basically looked like I was campaigning for funeral director. It was just this perfect little black outfit, which I guess hasn't changed that much. And people still knew I was 30. So, you deal with it. As far as the gender piece is concerned, we made it an issue, and this is consistent with a lot of research. There are female candidates who will sometimes inject gender into a race because they think it can be advantageous. So when we say that a race is gendered, it's not always that a male candidate is being sexist. We felt like it was important to say, look, 52% of the Rhode Island population is women, and look at your congressional delegation, look at the state legislature, and look at issues like reproductive rights. And so, we felt like it was an advantage. And there were, so some of the coverage looked like that as well, but it was driven by the message that we were trying to put out there. And the other thing that I should note is that as far as the gender dynamics are concerned, we learned early on that, and I had a sense of this from, again, research that I had conducted, that the media want to cover you and talk to you, and they want to get quotes and statements fast, right? So I decided to embrace them right from the outset, whether they were a hostile outlet or not. And then over the course of a year, you can develop really good relationships. And that's not to say that they're going to give you favorable coverage, but they're going to give you fair coverage. And I think that, that was really important. And I don't know if they were more sort of interested because I was an unconventional candidate. And being a woman in Rhode Island politics at the time was unconventional in and of itself. So that might have helped on that front.
So clearly a learning experience as part of this as well. Does it make sense to offer advice that says take on an incumbent or take on an open seat or your first try around, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's funny because as you know, as many of you probably know, everybody hates Congress, right? Everybody thinks that Congress would function better if, like literally 50% of people think Congress would function better if we nixed every incumbent and replaced them with random people walking down the street. Like that's what public opinion polls show. Everybody says that they want term limits, yet 92% of incumbents, even in bad election years, are reelected. And so I was thinking, well, I know these statistics, but that can't be true. It's true. And part of the reason it's true is because they have institutional advantages, they have fundraising advantages, they have relationships in the community. And so I would say that all else equal, go for an open seat. If you are going to take on an incumbent, make sure you can differentiate yourself. I mean, I think the reason we did as well as we did was because I was able to say, look, this is a Democratic district. There was literally no Republican running in the general election, so there was no chance that the seat was going to flip. The Democrats were well situated to take back the House in 2006. And my main argument was, why are you going to elect a Democrat that's helping facilitate the Republicans' agenda if you have the opportunity to elect a real Democrat? And so, in a case like that, if you can differentiate and if you can amass these resources, I don't think it's the worst idea in the world, but the odds of winning are way lower. I will say that I don't buy the whole career ladder politics situation. I don't think you need to start at the local level and then climb to the state legislature and then ultimately run for federal office. I think you're most compelling when you care about the issues that matter, right? And so if the issues that matter to you are federal issues, run for a federal office. If the issues that matter to you are local, run for a local office. I don't think we should just wait in line and climb the ladder and hope that in 27 years there might be an open seat for the House.
Thanks. I'm going to turn to a lot of questions about the report itself, but wanted to give the audience, if there were questions that you have at this point about Professor Lawless's
I'll answer anything.
Political career before we get to her scholarly career. Questions there?
Crickets.
All right, that's
Okay.
fine. There's lots about the report that we're excited to talk about too, right? So the report, the gender gap in political ambition, wondered if you could put this a bit in context. So this was not the first time that you were exploring this issue.
Right.
Tell us the background.
So in 2001, Richard Fox, who's a professor at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and I decided to do a national survey of potential candidates. At the time, women were significantly underrepresented in all political institutions. They were only about 10% of Congress. And study after study was finding at that time that women were winning races just as often as men. And the conventional wisdom had basically become, well, let's just be patient. The reason women are so underrepresented is because they haven't traditionally worked in the professions from which politicians come, like law and business, higher education. And if we're patient, as we see more and more women occupy those positions, we'll ultimately see more and more women run for office, and we know that they win at the same rate, so, all will be well. So we decided to put that to the test. Our hunch was that women and men in these professions might not actually be exactly the same. So we did a national survey of 4,000 lawyers, business leaders, educators, and political activists, an equal number of women and men. So what we were basically doing was approximating what the future would look like when you had an equal number of women in these professions. And this was a national sample, and we found, this is 2001, that whereas almost 60% of men had considered running for office, only about 43% of women had any office. Women were also way more likely than men to write it off as something that they would never do. 10 years later, in 2011, we replicated the study with a brand new crop of 4,000 potential candidates because a lot had changed in those 10 years. Hillary Clinton had run for president, and although she didn't get the nomination, she made women's representation a big issue. Nancy Pelosi had become Speaker of the House. Sarah Palin had been on the ticket as a vice presidential candidate. And then there were issues that also demonstrated that a woman's voice might not be the end of the world. The war in Iraq happened. 9/11 happened. Hurricane Katrina happened. So we do this study. It's a brand new group of people. The average age is the same, so it's basically the next generation. And the gender gap in political ambition was exactly the same. It was 16 percentage points. So in November, we did it again. So it's now 20 years after the first study. The gender gap in political ambition is 18 percentage points. And this is after you've had Hillary Clinton as the nominee, you have Kamala Harris as vice president, you have a record number of women going to Congress. The number of women in Congress since we conducted our first study has more than doubled. And you also have the Me Too movement, you have women's marches, you have calls for increasing women's representation. But what we basically show is that That's just the surface, and that's good and it's important, right? It's important to be able to identify people to run for Congress. It's important to be able to say, look, we now are at 35% of our political institutions and having women there, but that doesn't solve this fundamental inequity in society where politics still remains a game for men and women are far less likely to think about it. And the other thing that we found that was really striking was not only that the gender gap had remained roughly the same size over these 2 decades, but that it was the same no matter how you broke down the groups. So it was about 18 percentage points among whites. It was about 18 percentage points among people of color. It was the same size among people who had kids than who didn't. It was the same size generally regardless of income or profession. It didn't matter. Women of all walks of life were less likely than similarly situated men in each of those situations to have even considered running for office, to seriously consider it, to express interest in the future. And we found these gaps at all levels of office, although they did vary. They were the greatest when you looked at federal positions.
Let's break some of those down a little bit. So starting with political party, we look at Congress, for example, and we see a lot more women than men in the Democratic Party. A lot more women in the Democratic Party than women in the Republican Party in Congress. And so one might have anticipated a different gender gap among Democrats than Republicans, and you didn't find one.
It was a little bit smaller among Democrats, but it was still like 15 percentage points, right? So yes, it's true that Democratic women are a little bit more likely than Republican women to have considered running for office, but the reality is they're still far less likely than Democratic men to consider it. And the other thing I would note that was really interesting with regard to party, and this is not in the report, but for other analyses that we're running, on the Republican side of the aisle, the women and men who are interested in running are so ideological, so conservative. We asked a series of questions like, do you own a KN95 mask? Do you own a MAGA hat? Do you own a gun? Things like this to try and gauge sort of where people fall. We also asked a bunch of questions like, what would you rather do? We asked the Democrats, what would you rather do? Have lunch with Donald Trump or spend a night in jail, play a real-life version of the Squid Game, get a mild case of COVID? And then we asked the Republicans, what would you rather do? Have lunch with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or, hang out with Kim Jong-un? We asked a series of questions like this. And interestingly, most people would rather do the terrible thing than have lunch with the person who's on the other side of the aisle. But what we found were the people who were the most vitriolic toward Donald Trump and the most vitriolic toward AOC were the ones who were interested in running. And so on the Republican side of the aisle, this means that the women who will likely emerge are going to be the Lauren Boeberts and the Marjorie Taylor Greenes. They're not going to be the moderate Republican women that we used to see as sort of, the anticipated saviors of bipartisanship in Congress.
And is that new? Did you do something similar in the past?
This is new. So we don't, we had asked them a question about how conservative they were, and we'd asked them some policy questions.
Right.
But even 10 years ago, this affective polarization, the sense that you really don't like people on the other side of the aisle, was only beginning to gain traction. Now it's, totally alive and well. Now, it is true that there are studies that show that, Yankees and Red Sox fans hate each other just as much as Democrats and Republicans do, so we shouldn't necessarily think that politics is the root of all evil, but it's the root of a lot of evil. And I don't study baseball. So, maybe that would be the next report, but at this point, I care not so much that the gaps are just as big among, Yankees and Red Sox fans. I care about the party gap.
The other one I wanted to dive into a bit was this parental status. So it's not the case, seemingly, that moms don't want to run and so on?
Right. They don't, but neither do non-moms, right? So the issue here is that the way that I think about it is it's the new normal. So we've gotten to the point in society where women are able to juggle a lot of things, right? They used to have 2 jobs, so they used to have a regular job and then they still had the majority of the household tasks and childcare. Now they're able to do that and also consider or not consider running for office. And so what we found was that women who had children were not less likely than women without children to consider running. They were all not very likely to consider running. It didn't matter if you were married. It didn't matter if you were responsible for the majority of the household tasks. It didn't matter if you were responsible for the majority of the childcare. It didn't matter if you had a kid under the age of 6 at home. In all of those breakdowns, women were significantly less likely than men to consider running for office. The good news on this front is that over the 20 years, there actually has been movement in terms of equity in the distribution of household labor and childcare. We're not anywhere close to equity, but in 2001, I think women were something like 10 times more likely to be responsible for the household tasks and childcare, and now they're only like 5 times more likely. So, it's whether you're a glass is half full or glass is half empty person. What's interesting to me is that we have seen movement on that front, and it hasn't translated into any increase in ambition, which sort of reinforces this idea that your marital and parental status are not what's keeping you out of the electoral arena. It also reinforces the idea that we still have a lot of work to do, and your generation in particular, like when you're thinking about getting involved with somebody, you should ask, like, what are your thoughts on making the bed? I'm not even kidding, because you're going to find yourself in 20 years disgruntled while making a bed. That's my free advice for today.
Dating advice as well. I get a little of everything today. So that kind of 16 to 18% gap showing up over time, showing up across all of these different slices. One thing I was interested in, though, was it was a bit different depending on the race. Not race, but race that we're talking about here, in that there were about an equal number of men and women interested in running for school board, but more than twice as many men as women interested in running for Congress as you did. What do you make of those sorts of differences?
I mean, the school board difference is consistent with what a lot of researchers have found over time, which is that women are more likely to get politically involved around issues having to do with families and children. And so they might be more inclined to run for school board because their kids are in a school district and they're still the primary parent dealing with the schools. Initially, 20 years, these findings are consistent with what we found in 2001 and 2011. And so in 2001, we thought, well, maybe this is good news because they're thinking about, there's a long history of thinking about local politics as a stepping stone to higher office. And then a study came out which provided pretty compelling evidence that that's true except for school board. So if you run for city council or you run for mayor or water board commissioner, that tends to be a stepping stone. School board doesn't, largely because the people who run for school board are not running because they're politically ambitious. They're running because they want to fix a problem in their school at that particular time. So it does create a path. And the Republicans, Ralph Reed, the Christian Coalition, Republicans dating back to the 70s have actually tried to get candidates onto school boards to get them recognition in communities so that they can climb that political career ladder. So it's not to say that it can't be done, but for the people that are just generally selecting into those races themselves, it's not necessarily the kind of stepping stone that we would expect. That said, at least it's one elected office where we don't seem to have the same kinds of gaps that we have at the state or federal level.
Now, among your survey sample, these were all people who had never run before, or was that not a screening device?
So we had so this sample is about 2,300 people, 22 and change, and 8% had run for office in the past. They're still included because most of them are interested in running for office in the future. It's also important to keep them in the sample because they were equally likely to have won their races, which is consistent with the research that finds that when women run, they're just as likely to win. So there's basically this winnowing, and we've seen it over time, where you start with these equal numbers of women and men in the pool of potential candidates, then women are significantly less likely to consider running and run, and then you wind up with equal outcomes, yet twice as many men than women holding elected office because of that whole middle piece. And so it's that middle piece that we're interested in unpacking.
So when men and women are thinking about, okay, what would it actually take to run? You mentioned a couple, but not that many negative aspects of your campaign. But what are men and women thinking about at that point, and are they thinking about them differently?
They are thinking about them differently. So first of all, we asked about a series of mechanics associated with the campaigns, like how comfortable would you be with public speaking, going door to door, soliciting campaign contributions. And on all of these mechanics of the campaign, women were more reluctant than men. They were more likely to say that they would feel so negatively toward that experience that it would deter them from running for office. But women and men across the board are not that excited about it in the first place, right? It's not like 80% of men were like, sign me up to raise money and ask people I've never met for more money than they can afford to give. So right off the bat, it's important to keep in mind that people don't like the idea of running. And I think part of the reason they don't like it, and women in particular don't like it, is because of high-profile examples of terrible things that happen when people run for office. And that's based on the news media, right? Like, the news media aren't going to write a story that says, you know, Alabama Congressional District 3 race, very ho-hum, everyone's being nice. Like, that's not a story, right? Instead, the story is, you know, that Hillary Clinton isn't treated fairly, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is, you know, a colleague is threatening to assassinate her, right? Like, these are newsworthy stories. But I think they misrepresent the fact that we have 500,000 elected positions in this country, and those kinds of negative things and those kinds of terrible campaigns happen usually only for the highest levels of office and in very rare cases. And you know, so that I think is part of the issue. And then, you know, I framed my negative experiences by saying I can count on one hand the number of terrible things that happened. For the first 10 years that I was talking about my campaign, I would tell the stories of the terrible things and not provide the denominator because it was funny and it highlighted how terrible people can be. And it then became apparent to me that I was reinforcing this idea that it's terrible when women run, when it's not. And so I think it's important, and I think that that's what a lot of female candidates, whether they won or lost, tend to fixate on, because these are the interesting stories. They're very memorable. They demonstrate that we still have far to come in society. But you know, I do think it's important for people who have been in this position now to reiterate that there is no systematic bias against female candidates. That's not to say that you won't face bias or discrimination on an ad hoc basis, or that you won't come into contact with somebody who's sexist. Of course you will, but like, that's life, and that's gonna happen on the campaign trail or not. And so I think that between, you know, the media's draw toward negativity and conflict and female candidates' experiences that really remain salient with them, we send this signal that even if you're running for school board, you're gonna have to endure what Hillary Clinton endured when she ran for president. And the reality is that's not true. And similarly, I think there's a sense that it costs $1 million to run for anything, and that's not true. You know, it's true that if you're gonna run for Congress, you better be well situated to raise well over $1 million. If you're gonna run for a local position or even the state legislature in a lot of states, the average race could cost well under $10,000. And 50% of school board positions are completely uncontested. So the campaign really doesn't cost you anything unless you want to have some flyers to stick in people's mailboxes. And you know, so I think we have to do a better job highlighting the distinctions among these offices and what they would involve, especially if women's reticence is linked, at least in part, to the rigors of a campaign.
So to start countering this, it's going to be horrible. Do you want to tell us a story about what was exhilarating about your campaign, or a story about where you felt, hey, this is really rewarding?
Yeah, so the day before the election, so my election was on September 12th. September 11th of 2006 was the 5th anniversary of 9/11. And so there had been a lot of debate across the country about whether candidates should campaign or not. And generally, there was the idea that, yeah, we should, but a lot of those campaign events involved, you know, 9/11 related things. So I was with a campaign staffer, and we were at the State House in Rhode Island. There was a commemoration and sort of like, not service, but just sort of, you know, day of respect regarding 9/11. And so we were there, and all the candidates that were running for various statewide and congressional offices spoke. And as we were leaving, I was walking to my car, and I was crossing a really, really busy street. And there was a bus, and the bus driver stopped, and he started honking, and he yelled out the window, "Good luck, you've got my vote tomorrow." And I just remembered thinking, it worked. Even if I don't win, like, we communicated a message that was resonating with people that I'd never met, that I had never interacted with, who believed in what I was saying and the change I was trying to bring about. And for me, that meant so much, because it meant that even if we didn't pull off a victory, we brought issues to the table that people cared enough about, where they were gonna stop a bus and honk a horn and tell me. You know, and that just really, really mattered. And the other thing that I would say was really exhilarating was we did this, I wanted to get media coverage. It was winter, the primary was in September. So in January of the previous year, we decided, wouldn't it be fun, and I'm saying this facetiously, to walk 110 miles consecutively throughout the 2nd Congressional District, through all of the cities and towns. So I could say that I visited all of the cities and towns in the dead of winter and stop into every business along the way and meet everyone. That sounded like a really good idea, like in a campaign office. Now, I should note that since then, like I've run marathons and I've gotten a lot fitter. At the time, I don't think I'd ever exercised for more than 5 minutes, and it didn't occur to me that walking 110 miles required some degree of like physical ability. Also, it didn't occur to me that walking, there would be some days where we would walk. I had 9 days to do it because the semester was starting at Brown, and I was teaching. I couldn't go on leave. I couldn't afford to go on leave. So I had 9 days to walk these 110 miles, which meant that there were days where we were walking like 19 miles. One day in a sleet storm for the whole time. And so there was this day where we were walking, we couldn't even, and we had like supporters walk with us, or they would come at various points. My friends from college came, like, you know, anything to keep me not from crying, because it was literally the most physically traumatic experience of my life. And we were walking one day, and there was this sleet storm, and so no one was with me except like one guy from my campaign. And we're walking like along the side of a highway, and I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous. Like if I would have seen this, I don't even know what I would have thought. And we can't carry signs or anything because they'll just get totally soggy. So this police car pulls over to ask if we need help, and I'm like, no, no, no. I'm Jennifer Lawless. He's like, oh, you're walking. Good luck, and just drove away. Right? So like, but we kind of knew, all right, they at least know that we're doing this. And we finished it, and I was able to say that I had walked through these 22 cities and towns. And I do think that it was informative. You know, like I think when you're running, you tend to think about high population areas. You think about how you can get the most votes. And we wound up winning 5 of the cities and towns in the state. So, you know, 20% of them. And I'm sure it was because no candidate had ever gone there before, right? And people don't like feeling ignored. We've learned that in 2016. We learned it again in 2020. But, you know, I think even in congressional races going back, people feel like, well, if no candidate ever comes to their city or town, what difference does it make? Like, why are they going to get involved? And seeing a crazy woman walking in the sleet might have generated, you know, at least some excitement on the part of voters. So it was, you know, that was very exhilarating, even though that was like a terrible, terrible day. I'm sorry?
Intrepid, enthusiastic, not crazy. That's right. Yeah. So there's self-perceptions right there,
yep.
As well as here. The idea that men seem to be more than willing to label themselves as very qualified to run, women 3 times more likely to view themselves as not qualified at all. Does that strike you as overconfidence by men, underconfidence by women, something a little both?
It's the truth is probably somewhere in between. I mean, the important thing is that if you looked at the women and men that we surveyed and interviewed over these 20 years, you wouldn't be able to differentiate them on paper, right? Like their resumes are exactly the same. Their levels of political interest and political participation are the same. Their household incomes and other demographics are the same. And so, you know, we have as well matched a group of women and men as we can possibly come up with. And then when you ask them, how qualified do you think you are to run for office, we wind up with these staggering differences. And you know, these differences have been seen in lots of different realms. There are studies of 4th graders, and they're asked after they take a test, after they take a math test, how well do you think you did? And the boys always say that they did really, really well, and the girls say that they didn't. And it turns out that they did equally well. And then they ask them about these reading tests, how well do you think that they did? And the boys and girls are equally likely to say that they did not do well. So the guys at least know that they don't do well in reading. But it turns out that, so the girls and the boys self-assesses the same on the reading tests, and the girls way outperformed the boys. So, you know, we've seen it there. We've seen it on boards in businesses, and we're seeing it in politics. And so what we did in 2001 was delve a little bit more deeply. We did interviews with 400 of the people that we surveyed, 200 women and 200 men, and in large part to get at this qualifications gap. And then we've asked, based on what we learned, we've asked additional questions in the other surveys. And we found a couple of things. First, women and men judge themselves by completely different standards. So when you ask a man, do you think he's qualified to run for office? The men said things to us like, of course I'm qualified. My state senator is a moron, right? Women would say, I'm not Hillary Clinton, I'm not qualified, right? Or you'd ask them, well, do you think that the people in office are qualified? And the men would say things like, absolutely not. That's why I know I could do this. And you'd ask the women and they'd say, absolutely not. We need all better people in office, right? I'm not qualified, they're not qualified. And then in addition to that, men said that they basically determined their qualifications based on their temperament and whether they had vision and passion. And when we asked women what they were relying on to determine whether they were qualified, they listed 20 objective credentials that no one person would ever have. So a man says, I need vision. A woman says, I need a law degree, an MBA, public policy experience, connections in the community, and $1 million. It's a lot easier to have vision. So, whether women are underestimating their qualifications or men are overestimating them, the reality is that we need to figure out a way to get them to think about them the same way. And based on life, my bet is that we're not going to be able to convince men that they have an inflated sense of self. So we might do better trying to encourage women to see how powerful and how empowered they can be if they think about this in a way where they don't have to hold themselves up to a hypothetical standard, but they can sort of hold themselves up to a realistic standard that they clearly have already cleared.
Any progress on experimental designs that get us there, or something in the field?
I mean, there are experiments that are like actual lab experiments.
Yep.
To try and get at, like you want to be captain of a math team, and a man says, and you tell them, you're not very good at math. Like you give them a series of math questions, right? And you say, you only got 3 of these right. Do you still want to be the team captain? And the guy's like, yeah, right? And you say to a woman, you got 1 wrong. And she's like, well, then I could never be captain. So it's very difficult to think about how to begin to close these gaps because it's so widespread. I do think, I've spoken to people at Emily's List and a lot of other, She Should Run, the Women's Campaign Fund. I've spent a lot of time working with organizations that recruit women to run for office. And I think what they're trying to do, consistent with my research, is letting women know that this gap exists and why it exists. Because when you say to a woman, this is how a man is deeming himself qualified and this is how you're deeming yourself qualified, that seems to resonate. And I think it's also important that they're doing that because I think for a while, we were seeing this sort of hamster wheel of candidate trainings that women felt they needed to go to, right? So women are doubting their qualifications. And what the people at Emily's List told me was that, so women were constantly calling saying, well, where can I go for a training? Well, where can I go for a second training? How can I get into a third candidate school? And it's like you're just developing 15 more credentials. You're delaying your entrance, and are you ever going to think, is that 15th credential really going to be what makes you think now you're qualified, or are you going to look for the 16th and the 17th and the 18th? And so, I think working with women's organizations that are already encouraging women to think about throwing their hats into the arena and sharing with them this kind of information can go some way. But it's so deeply embedded, and because it's not just about politics, it's a problem. And the one thing I'd add to that is the thick skin issue is a big one. Women say that they don't have thick enough skin to run for office. And they tend to perceive the political arena as one where there's more bias against female candidates than law or business or education. The irony is that there's actually less because of partisanship, right? So you can be a card-carrying sexist, and you're still going to vote for the woman who shares your party affiliation because voting against that person would mean that you'd be voting for either a Democrat or a Republican, and you're not a Democrat or a Republican. In a law firm, if you're a card-carrying sexist, you can behave in a way that actually works to the detriment of a woman. In a business, you can also get sued, but in a business, you can do the same thing. So ironically, partisanship has made it easier for people who are, very reluctant to support women's rights or women's advancement to still support female candidates. And I think that message needs to get out there too.
So women are evaluating themselves on different criteria, but even on the same criteria, there were some gaps that were emerging there, like this idea of, do I know enough about public policy? We're in a school of public policy, so thinking about that. And equally credentialed women thinking, no, I don't know enough about public policy.
Right. Yeah, we had asked, and it wasn't just enough about public policy, we asked them elsewhere on the survey, do you have experience public speaking? Do you have public policy credentials? Have you ever been on the board of a nonprofit organization? Have you ever had to organize citizens in the community? There were no differences on whether they actually did any of those things. But then when we asked them about their perceptions of whether they did them well, that's where we see these gaps. And they can't be true because then these women wouldn't still have their jobs, right? Like if these women were so terrible and so underperforming on every level, there's no way that they would still be employed in the exact same positions in the same professions. And so, it's interesting to me that it's not just this broad qualifications question, it's even when you ask something specific. But think about it in your own classes. I see this all the time. How many times has a professor said to you, okay, they ask a question, right? And no one wants to answer, and they encourage people to answer. And then a guy will raise his hand and say, well, I didn't do the reading, but it seems to me that, right? And he's like taking one for the team. He's just going to participate, right? When a woman does that, she'll raise her hand, and this happens at least once a semester when I'm teaching. She'll raise her hand and say, well, I'm not really sure, but I think that maybe in footnote 6, the author might have alluded to X, and then she'll read a quote, right? And it's like the perfect answer. It's totally thoroughly developed, and the guy is like, I didn't read. Like, how do you get around that, right? Like, and how many times is that guy called out, right? Like, maybe in a jokey way. Occasionally I'll do it in a jokey way because I find it so offensive and ridiculous, but most people don't do that. And so it's just constantly reinforced that, women and men don't operate in the same realm and they don't think about themselves the same way. And it's tricky because you don't want to tell women, well, just become like men and you'll be fine in politics. But instead, you have to encourage them to realize that they have the attributes and the traits that would actually make for excellent candidates. And that's a tough order.
Mm-hmm. So some of that falls back on friends, falls back on those who might recruit women to run, and yet again a finding right here that women were less likely to be recruited by political actors, less likely to be encouraged to run by family members who said, you're 30, you cannot run for this office, spouses, people at their churches, places of worship, workplaces, across the board.
Yeah, so we broke up sort of types of political recruitment into formal political actors, so elected leaders, party leaders, members of political organizations, those people who would really have a message that we thought would resonate if they said to somebody, hey, you should run for office. And there were very substantial gender gaps on all of those indicators. They were way more likely to ask men or to suggest to men that they think about running. But then we also asked about family members, spouses, clergy, friends, and we saw the same thing. What was very interesting, though, is that, again, I think there's a perceptions difference here. And I can just tell you one example based on two of the people that we had interviewed. Studies of political gatekeepers find that they're not actually much more likely to identify men as candidates. And they say that they encourage women all the time and that the women are not receptive. But then we had these data that suggested that that was not the case. And so to try and reconcile those two in our interviews, it became clear that, again, the truth is probably somewhere in between. So we had done two interviews. I had done these two interviews the same day, and I had spoken to this woman in the morning and had asked her if she had ever considered running for office, if anybody had ever recruited her, if she thought she was qualified. And she said no to all of those questions. And then later on during the interview, she was telling me about an issue that she really cared about. It had to do with the school board, and that maybe if she was ever going to run for office, she might consider running for school board, but probably not. And I said, well, tell me more about this. And she told me about this meeting that she had had with the mayor of her town, because she had been active in the Parents Association. She went to meet with the mayor. She had already met with the school board to figure out some kind of education policy change. And the mayor said to her, the issue is that you also need to get the city council on board. And there's going to be an open seat on the city council. You should run for it. Like, I can help you run for this position. I can put you in touch with the right people. And so she's telling me the story in a completely different context. And I said, wait a minute, the mayor of your town suggested that you should run for office? And she said, oh, well, he wasn't serious. The very same day, I interviewed this guy, and I asked the same set of questions. And he said, oh, it's funny that you're asking me this. I was actually recruited to run for office very recently. And I said, oh, tell me what happened. And he tells me that he's at an airport. He's in O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and his flight got delayed. He was a businessman. He went to the bar to get a drink while he was waiting for the flight, and CNN was on, and he's, I guess, offering commentary along with the panelists on CNN, and the bartender says to him as he's getting ready to leave, you know a lot about this, you should run for office. And like, that resonated to the extent that he's telling me that that was a political recruitment opportunity for him, right? And so, I'm not suggesting that women are being handed keys to the city all over the place and they don't realize it, and that every guy that runs for office received a suggestion at like a local watering hole. But I do think that that anecdote suggests that we probably need to message differently to women versus men. And when we say we think that you should consider running for office, we should probably, and this is us too, right? Because informal recruitment by friends, family members matters. We should probably stop and say, like, I really mean it. Like, I'm not just blowing smoke. Like, this is not just a passing reference. You would be great, and this is why you should do it. And so, I think that that is a lesson that we have to start taking up, because just a generic statement about we need more people in politics like you, or a general statement at a dinner party like, oh, you should run for office, is not going to resonate the same way with a woman as it is a man.
So I have more questions, but our audience also has been waiting patiently. What are your experiences? What do you have as questions? Yes, there's a mic coming over. Thanks.
Hi, is this working? Hi, my name is Julie. I'm a first-year undergrad here. I'm wondering, you touched briefly on the intersectionality between gender and partisanship. I'm wondering if you think that decreasing the gender gap in politics would help with bipartisanship.
Funny you ask. No. So there's a lot of speculation out there that women are like the only adults in Washington, right? And so if you look at the covers of lots of different magazines, you get that we need women in Congress to solve all of our problems, that we need women to make sure that the parties come together. And there's this general sense that they're more collaborative and more collegial and more willing to cross the aisle because they care about getting things done, whereas men just care about raw power. And you can find examples of this for sure. So Sean Theriault, who's at the University of Texas, and I decided to put this theory to the test because it seemed to us that there were a lot of women that behaved pretty badly when it comes to partisanship as well. So what we did was we looked at every vote that members of Congress took, whether they were procedural votes about sort of moving the process forward or substantive votes on policy. We also looked at all of the trips they took. These are known as CODELs, congressional delegations, and whether those trips were, these are fact-finding missions, right? Whether they were on a partisan or a bipartisan CODEL. We looked at all of the bills that they co-sponsored and all of the co-sponsors that they received for their own bills. And we also looked at whether they were more likely to engage in social engagement activities. So basically, did they have more congressional school spirit, right? Because the idea is that they're more likely to build relationships. We see these stories all the time about how the women in the Senate go out to dinner on a monthly basis. They have a bowling team. They sort of work in a very bipartisan way. The Congressional Women's Softball game is Democratic and Republican women together versus the press. Whereas the men, it's the Democrats versus the Republicans in the congressional baseball game. So we also had these gauges of collegiality. And our gauges of collegiality, it was kind of silly, but they were all we could get, were did you participate in the Congressional Secret Santa? Did you participate on Seersucker Thursday? This is a day that they harken back to the time when the Capitol didn't have air conditioning, and so everybody's supposed to wear seersucker suits, and then everybody that participates goes to a special lunch. And did you participate in the Congressional softball or baseball game? And it turned out that women were way more likely to have congressional school spirit. They were participators, right? Like participants. They participated in Secret Santa. They wore seersucker. They went to the baseball game. They went to the softball game. They did all of the things that you would want in your, like school spirit kind of person. And it didn't matter at all. They were no more likely to engage in any kind of bipartisanship on any of those other measures. Moreover, being participatory, having this kind of congressional spirit, whether you were a man or a woman, didn't predict whether you were more bipartisan on any of those other things. So I think that having more women in Congress is a good thing in that. I should also note that these data went through 2016, and since then we've had some evidence to suggest that even that school spirit might be disintegrating among women. But I think it's possible that you would wind up with a more collegial environment and maybe less, sort of less nastiness, fewer ad hominem attacks, and maybe it would be just a generally nicer place to work. I don't think it would do anything, based on our research, I don't think it would do anything to generate more bipartisanship. And why would it? Women are equally likely to be interested in getting reelected. They're equally likely to be responsive to their constituents. And so they don't want to be known as the person who crossed party lines and facilitated the other party's agenda.
Hi, I'm Claire, first year here, and I was wondering, you conducted all this research before you ever personally even ran for office, and I was wondering if there's anything in particular that prompted you or inspired you to start this research on this topic.
The main thing that inspired me was that I really couldn't wrap my head around the fact that there were so few women in politics and a literature that had basically concluded that everything was fine, we just have to be patient. Like, that just seemed to fly in the face of, well, of all of my personality characteristics, but also of reality. Like, something just seems wrong with that. And I should note that that idea didn't just come out of thin air. I was in 11th grade when Anita Hill came before the Senate Judiciary Committee during the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, and we had to watch them. So in my history class in high school, we watched the hearings. And it was the first time that I remember being very cognizant of an all-male Judiciary Committee grilling a woman about sexual harassment. And I think that put on my radar screen the idea that politics involves lots of issues that have nothing to do with being only a white man, yet it's basically only white men that are legislating around these issues and making decisions. And so that seed had been planted, and then by the time I got to graduate school and I sort of realized that, people were like, we're good, just wait 20 years, you're gonna be happy. That was basically the impetus where I was like, I'm gonna check this out. I'm gonna not take your word for it, I'm gonna see.
Hi, I'm Maya Stevens. I'm a second-year MPP student. Thank you for having this conversation. One little experience I'm having right now is I'm on a job hunt, and I have a dialogue with a lot of my fellow students in the same situation, and but women in particular, we have to remind ourselves constantly to we're significantly more likely to think we're less qualified for a position. We kind of have this little empowerment group chat to kind of fight that. But I had a question kind of about earlier, you were just talking about your findings. How do you see your findings interacting with kind of a dialogue about representation matters in politics, so for the gendered part of it at least? Do you see it counter to that, they're not really related? Or maybe to an earlier point of yours, is it that there's overrepresentation in the media of the negative parts of being a woman in politics?
So I would say that until 2018 and the midterm elections where women made very, very substantial gains, the way that I would have characterized the work and the importance of the work is that democratic legitimacy and political representation are predicated on the idea that women and men are equally likely to at least have it appear on their radar screen that politics is an option, right? And that until we have more women in politics, we can't fully represent all of the different perspectives that are out there. That's not to say that all women are the same, that all men are the same, but something seems fundamentally wrong with a system where the majority of men feel like it's open to them, the majority of women don't, and then they're the ones making political decisions. And I think that violated a sense of simple justice, and there were clear representational implications. And it was even worse on the Republican side of the aisle because almost all of the women that were elected were Democrats, which meant that if you were a Republican woman in the electorate, you rarely had any opportunity to cast a ballot for a woman even. Donald Trump comes along, there's a backlash, and we've now seen significant upticks in the numbers of both Republican and Democratic women holding office. And I think that here, it now becomes a little bit trickier to frame these findings because I do think we're at a point in time now where we could probably get to close to parity, especially on the Democratic side. But that doesn't mean that we've done anything to close the gender gap in political ambition, right? All it means is that we've created a situation where we've recruited enough individual women for specific seats where they're now, let's say, 45% of the US Congress. But we can't really say signed, sealed, and delivered, mission accomplished, when there's still an 18 percentage point gender gap in the population, and women still don't think in general that government is open to them. That, to me, is still a problem for democratic legitimacy and simple justice, even if it's not for numeric representation. And so I think it's vital to close that gap, and I think that closing that gap, we think that there's something fundamentally wrong when we don't have women in math and science. We think that there's something, and it's not as open to them, right? The entire STEM movement is to make sure that girls are aware of the fact that these positions are important, that they should consider them, and that we should be leveraging the capital that they can provide by obtaining those credentials. We don't do that with politics because people hate politics and they think it's disgusting and members of Congress are yucky and you have to be corrupt and a bad person to get involved. And as a result, I think that there's still this fundamental problem where we're not encouraging women to think about 500,000 positions that are ultimately making key decisions that you can't make behind the scenes. A lot of the time women will say, well, I'm politically active and I'm represented because I work behind the scenes or I'm on a board or I'm pulling the strings. You're not at that table at the end of the day. And the thought of being at that table is not occurring to you, so you're not structuring your life in a way where you could make that happen. And I think that that's really important. As far as the media are concerned, I mean, I don't know. I think that they've gotten better in terms of providing context. I think they've gotten better in terms of calling out episodes of sexism. Unfortunately, I don't think that they're not saying things like, this is rare, right? So they're reinforcing this idea that it's difficult. They're also, I think, highlighting what they think is a major step toward parity, but at the same time, that sort of undermines the fact that, well, at the local level, we're still, there are literally hundreds of thousands of more men than women in politics, and people aren't thinking about it. So I think it's a challenge, and the messaging is really a challenge.
So my last question, political reforms or policy reforms that would either close the ambition gap or the gender gap more generally?
I mean, so a lot of people say, well, what about quotas? No, I would say that quotas are not a solution because quotas solve a demand problem, not a supply problem. Quotas are a way to say to people, look, you might be sexist or you might be racist or you might be whatever. We're giving you these candidates. You have to choose one of them. And that's going to change the way that you think about people. Voters are willing to vote for women. Donors are willing to give to women. The media cover women. That's not the problem. It's that women are less likely to run in the first place. And you can't compel women to run. So any sort of reform on that front, I think, is a dead end. I think the best that we can do is, in a very grassroots way, identify women that we think would make excellent candidates and, tell them to run. And there are more and more women's organizations that are doing that. I think what we need are non-women's organizations spending a lot more time identifying female candidates, right? Like you can't leave, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee identifies a lot of candidates to run. They basically rely on Emily's List for a lot of their information, right? They're not out there independently also scouting women. Emily's List can't be responsible for ensuring that we have Democratic parity across 500,000 elected offices. Like, they're one little building in DC. I mean, they're a powerhouse, but you can't expect that. And then what happens on the Republican side? So, I think until it becomes a norm and until we're constantly, just as people, identifying others that we think would be good in politics, we have a problem. And I will end with one very brief anecdote. I did interviews at both the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee about their recruitment strategies and what they're looking for. And when we went into the DNC, you guys won't know this reference, but some of you might. It looked like a Benetton ad. Benetton used to have these ads where they were like, it was the most diverse group of people you would ever see, and they're all holding hands, like singing Kumbaya, literally, right? And the DNC's message was, this is what matters to us. We need to make sure that we're recruiting this really diverse array of candidates, and this is going to be the way that we move forward. And we walked into the Republican headquarters, and we're meeting with this, it was the Republican Congressional Committee. We walk into the executive director's office, and there are these headshots with big red X's through them, like poster size across the room. And we're like, what is that? And he's like, oh, these are the Democrats we knocked off last time around. And so the difference there just demonstrates, like, one party is focusing on trying to be inclusive, the other party is focusing on doing whatever it will take to win an election. And when we spoke to him, he said, they're not opposed to recruiting women. They're not opposed to recruiting people of color. They don't care, but they want to be as competitive as they possibly can be in as many races as they possibly can be. And that means identifying as many self-funding candidates with political experience as they can. And those are still white men. And so just if we think about moving forward and what reforms we would actually need, the parties are in such different places that it's difficult to think about any sort of broad policy. That's why I think it comes down to the grassroots level and the people who are in a position to actually talk to candidates or potential candidates and tell them that it's worth doing. So I would be remiss not to tell you that even if you don't do it, everybody in this room should at least consider running for office. It's one thing if you write it off as something that's fundamentally unappealing. It's another if it never appears on your radar screen in the first place. So consider it appeared.
Jen Lawless, thanks for running.
Of course.
Thanks for the research, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.